Hey everybody, it's Rob from Reason Prep. So they've just released the first full-length practice PSAT for the new SAT, and I wanted to give you my thoughts on it. So first, if you're interested, in the description below, there's a link to the College Board's website where you can download the PSAT and the answers if you want to check it out yourself. Also, there'll be a link to my website just in case they move the link or take it down and for some reason it becomes inaccessible. So if you want to check out the test yourself first, if you're going to be taking the new SAT, you might be interested in trying it yourself to see your own impressions. But what I'm going to do in this video is basically give you my thoughts about this test. So I took the test, did all 4 sections. There's 1 section of reading, 1 section of writing, and 2 of math. I did it under timed conditions. And basically I'm going to give you my first uncensored, raw, off-the-cuff remarks. Obviously, we'll learn a lot more about this test as the weeks and months go on. They might change it, and we obviously haven't had any full SATs yet. So we will obviously get more information. What's the take-home point? So the main thing I want to impart to you that I learned about the PSAT is that overall, I think it's an easier test than the current PSAT, the current SAT. It's a thinner test. There's much less material that they're covering, whether you're looking at math, reading, or writing. It's thinner in that regard. And essentially what it is an ersatz ACT, an ersatz ACT. In other words, it's just kind of a cheap, poor imitation of the current ACT. In fact, kind of like an easier version. Now, of course, this is a PSAT. It's not a full SAT. We'll see how that compares. But it certainly is almost, the writing section is indistinguishable, for example, from what you would find on an ACT test, with the exception of some charts and graphs and stuff. But otherwise, it's the same kind of activity. My real feelings are, obviously, it's just one test, and this is initial. My real thoughts are that students are going to pretty much destroy this test, especially if they practice for it, if they get preparation for it, and they know how to tackle it. Any fears about this test being harder or trickier or I think are unfounded, just based on my first initial thoughts. I think students, especially strong students, are going to absolutely destroy this test. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, what I think the consequences of that might be. There was some talk earlier when the changes were made, people complaining that the test is being dumbed down, and I kind of honestly see that. I think it is a dumbed down test, and it's kind of sad. It's kind of sad that this test and the way in which it was formed over decades, the way in which it approached the material, the way in which it tested students. Obviously, it's got its problems, and I don't want to make it seem like the SAT was the greatest test in the world, but it's truly gone in the ways that we originally saw it, that we've seen it for decades. And we're going to have to come to grips with that, and I think the winners, though, will be students, because it will be such a more manageable test in many ways compared to the current incarnation, that I think students will benefit, assuming that there's no chaos, and I'll get into a little bit more about that later. So let me go through each section one by one. Let's start with the reading. The reading was 60 minutes, 47 questions, so one huge chunk. It was 5 passages, one of which was a dual. So that was quite the slog to go through that entire section, 5 passages at once. Pretty dense in that way. But overall, I mean, it shares some of the similarities with the old SAT in terms of the kinds of questions they ask, the choices. It's not like the ACT in that sense. I mean, there are some similarities, I guess, between the ACT reading and the SAT reading, but the SAT reading is, I think, closest to its original its source, closest to the old SAT. I would say the passages are easier, at least for the 5 I saw. Not very complex at all. I mean, compare this to some of the stuff you see on the old SAT, where it's just like philosophy and all this crazy, nutty stuff. The passages on this test were pretty straightforward, as were many of the questions. I think overall, though, it's going to be easier for a couple huge reasons. Number one, there's only 4 choices instead of the 5 you have on the old test. And this makes a huge difference. Also, couple that with the fact, number 2, there's no guessing penalty. So you're going to be putting an answer for every single question. Out of 4, 2 of the choices are usually absolutely ridiculous. So at worst case, most of the time, you'll be stuck between 2. And then it's a 50-50 guess. I think what you're going to see, and I'll talk about this more with the math and the writing later, the curves are going to be, I don't know what they're going to do with the curves, because you are going to be getting so many more right just by virtue of guessing and by virtue of having to choose among fewer choices. And having also fewer questions on this, I don't know how it's going to work out, how they're going to be able to separate out the scores in the way that they did. One of the virtues, if you want to call it that, of the old test was that the vocabulary helped spread out the tails a bit. The difficult questions, the complex passages were able to spread out students at the lower end and the upper end, especially at the upper end. And I don't know if we're going to see that on the new test. Overall, I mean, you can look at some of the questions yourself. There were fewer line reference questions, which surprised me, but more of the questions where you had to provide it's like a question, and then the question after it was one where you had to provide the line reference that is the evidence for the question before it. And I kind of realized what they've done is instead of giving you the line reference, they're essentially asking you for that line reference. But in so doing, I found when I was doing the test, I would read this question, I would see the next one would be one of those questions where I had to find the line that supported the answer to the previous, and I was able to do them both at the same time almost. Use the suggestions in that question to go back to the passage and kind of use those as line references and see which one made sense. So in fact, in some ways, they're kind of easier because they're kind of saying, okay, the answer is in one of these lines, so if you find that and find the answer in the question, you're good. So in some ways, almost easier than just having the line reference and having to dig into the questions yourself. There's some new questions with charts and graphs. I've shown some of these in the reading videos. Pretty pointless, tacked on, not very interesting or difficult, I didn't think. So we'll see if they get any farther with that, if they push that anymore. But pretty much nothing. Overblown, I'd say, in terms of a change. They, as you know, probably they got rid of sentence completions, and in fact, they've gotten rid of a lot of heavy vocabulary that we would see on the old test. They do have the vocab and context questions, and they did trumpet this as like, oh, we're going to talk about meanings of words and context, blah, 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 blah. They've done that before. All they've done on this test is they've taken those exact same vocab and context questions, made the vocabulary easier, and sliced off a choice. So they're much easier than they were on the old test, and now there's no other vocabulary pretty much at all throughout the section. Again, I just don't know how they're going to separate people out on the ends. I think most students are going to just crush these questions, even the ones with, ostensibly that have some kind of vocabulary. Just going to crush them. So we'll see how this plays out. Obviously, we have to see a real test, a real SAT, but it's looking kind of grim, I think, for the way that the scoring is going to work out. And then finally, I thought the answer choices were disappointingly not as creative as they used to be. Again, it's a way of me saying that this test is easier. The reading was easier. The choices were not as tricky. I never really found myself getting stuck between two. It was a 60-minute section. I completed it in less than 30 minutes and got them all right. Again, I'm a SAT tutor. This is what I do for a living, but I mean, come on, it can't be that easy. I mean, I did it in 30 minutes, not really paying much attention, and it wasn't that taxing. So again, I don't want to say that's what it's going to be for everybody, but I think it's a sign that with training and with practice, this section will be even more coachable than the current old SATs reading. Now for the math. The math was disappointing in the sense that it was surprisingly thin on content. So there was a lot of algebra, a little bit of geometry, a little bit of stats and charts and graphs, but very thin overall. Disappointing in that sense. I mean, the old SAT was never deep with the content, of course. It only tests really 7th and 8th and 9th grade math, but it was able to find creative ways to use that content. Since this test has divorced itself from attempting to use mathematical concepts in creative ways to make you think and to make you have to reason, right? Because the SAT currently is the SAT reasoning test and is no longer going to be that. Because they're limiting themselves to basically testing you with questions that you've done in math class before, they're very shallow and very thin. So overall, they're pretty boring problems. I think creativity is not at all required much anymore. You have to do a little bit of reading. I think one of the little tricky parts is they've retained some of their little cheap shot tricks where they want you to solve for one thing when you're solving for another, and you got to make sure you give them the right answer. But again, with 4 choices, there's just fewer opportunities to make mistakes and picking the wrong answer choice. There were a couple times where I messed up, but the answer I got wasn't in the choices, so I knew I didn't make a mistake. I knew I made a mistake, so I can go back and check it. Yeah, I would say overall, though, I think it's going to be a very coachable test. So one of the sections, there's 2 sections. There's a calculator permitted section and a calculator not permitted section. The calculator not permitted section, I'm kidding you not, there were 17 questions. 16 of them were algebra. And the 17th was sort of like a geometry question, but in the end, you needed to use algebra to solve it. So every single one of those questions, those 17 questions for calculator not permitted, were algebra. And if you think about it, it's almost like they have to do it that way because they can't do crazy percents or decimals or anything like that because you don't have a calculator in that section. So we'll see what they do. But the calculator permitted section had a bit more diversity. So it had some stats and some percents and stuff like that, but very dominated by algebra. And disappointingly, by questions you have probably done in math class, just very boring, middle of the road stuff. So I think the real lesson here, again, just like I said with the reading, is if you're a strong math student, you're going to obliterate this section. I do not know how they're going to separate out the tails. You're going to have so many people getting pretty much every single one right, in my opinion. This is just my thoughts. Getting every single one right or getting really close. I don't know how they're going to separate it out. The old test, for all of its problems, had really tricky questions that had to make you think and approach the material in different ways. This test largely does not. If you paid attention to math, if you're good at math, if you review the material, it's a very repetitive test, so if you know the kinds of things they like to test, I think students will crush this. I really do. I think this is going to be not good for the College Board. And I've saved the best for last, so the writing section. This one was absolutely pathetic. It's very, very disappointing. Obviously, I'm not a good representative for the student body population. I'm a professional tutor. This is what I do. But I finished the section, I'm not kidding, I timed this, in 14 minutes. And how many questions was it? Okay, I finished it in 14 minutes. That's 44 questions. It was like 4 passages or something like that. 14 minutes, and I got them all right. So I had 21 minutes left. You've got 35 minutes total. I finished it in 14 minutes, and I got them all right, with barely breaking a sweat. Now, again, I'm not saying this to brag or even saying like this is going to be your experience, but that's not a good sign. Like, I barely had to work at this to crush it. So when I go out, when other tutors go out to teach this, and we give you the approach and we give you the strategies and the content, you're going to do just as well. So how are they going to make this test difficult? That's my main question. How are they going to really challenge students, especially at the top end? But frankly, everywhere. I think the scores are going to be much more compressed. It's going to be, it's going to be a problem, I think, moving forward. It will also be interesting to see how they balance out the reading, the writing, and the math. So the reading and the writing are technically part of one section, the evidence-based reading and writing section. On this test, there were 98 reading and writing questions, and 91 reading and writing questions, and 48 math. So, and yet the math is out of 800, and the reading and writing is out of 800. How does that work? It's a weird mixture there, right? How can you have an 800 scaled score for 48 questions, and then an 800 scaled score for 91? It's like really unbalanced sections. I think the combining of the reading and the writing, I understand why they did it, but they have to, I don't know what they would have to do, but I don't know how the scoring is going to work out as a result. So some final thoughts. I think, again, it's a test that's very similar to the ACT, and some might say in some ways the ACT is easier in terms of the questions just because they are much more like what you're used to doing in school. But where the ACT makes up for it is in the time. They restrict your time. They make you rush. So you have to think faster. And that's what makes the test difficult, right? It's really the time pressure. The SAT, however, the PSAT, hasn't done this. I mean, you have 60 minutes for 47 questions in the reading, whereas on the ACT, you've got 35 minutes for 40. I mean, right there shows you the big difference. So I think this will be a problem. Again, I reiterate, I don't know how the curve is going to work. How are they going to make this test difficult for people on the ends? I worry about that. Ultimately, I think what we have here, to sum up, is a test built by committee. A test built by committee where everyone's trying to get their little piece in, right? We have these charts and graphs thrown in on reading, charts and graphs thrown in on writing. We make the math look more like reading. We make sure we throw our founding document history into reading. We make sure we throw our science in, and we make sure we make the test look like the ACT, right? It reads to me as if, I mean, it is in some sense, a business decision. It's like, okay, the ACT is eating our lunch. How do we catch up? Well, we do what we do generally in business. We copy what our competitors have done as far as we can, and then try to push our branding advantage, which is essentially what they're doing, right? We're the SAT, but essentially it's just a bad ACT, to wrap it all up. And in terms of lessons for you, I think if you are going to be taking this new test, never fear. It will be very coachable. So any claims to the contrary, I think, are bogus in my opinion. And I think it'll be very coachable, and I think there'll be a lot of instability about how this test is implemented. Again, we haven't seen full SATs. We'll see how it works there, but I don't see why it should be any different for the full test. There's going to be a lot of instability in how this test is implemented, how it's scored, how it compares to the ACT, and how colleges will use it in their admissions process. So this will be interesting, but I think never fear. If you stick with me, if you stick with Reason Prep, if you put in the effort, put in the time, you will have no issues whatsoever I think, on the new version of the SAT. But it remains to be seen. We'll see how things go. So if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to chime in the comments below. I love getting feedback. If you've taken the test and you have experiences with it or anything like that, or if you have any feedback on this video, please leave a comment below and let me know what you think. All right, I'll talk to you soon.